Bonjour, Anin. My name is Cree Rose Duker. I am the program manager for community engagement at Native Governance Center. And again, just really happy to gather with you all today. I personally am joining from Casa Grande, Arizona. It's my partner's hometown where he grew up. And I've been living here for 2 years now, but very happy to be a guest on these lands. Originally the homelands of the Tohono O'odham and Pipash peoples, and currently neighbors with the Tohono O'odham and Pipash, as well as the Akchin communities today. And on behalf of Native Governance Center, I just want to provide a big welcome and thank you for joining us all today for this session. Native Governance Center, if you haven't heard of us before or are maybe new to our work, we're a Native-led, woman-led nonprofit supporting Native nations in strengthening their governance systems and their capacity to exercise their sovereignty. And to share just a little bit about what we do, we serve Native nations directly through a lot of our core programming, including our incredible leadership development program known as the Native Nation Rebuilders, of which we have over 200 Native changemakers as alumni. We also provide really incredible support through our tribal governance support. They've been hosting a lot of candidate forums and different community-led listening sessions this summer. And we've been providing free resources for all through our community engagement program. Also want to provide a shout out to our tribal finance team for the really incredible work they do with Native nations in developing and strengthening their tribal finance systems. And they're on cohort 3 of that work now, so doing recruitment. And for today's event, Seeds of Our Ancestors Reviving Indigenous Foodways, we're really excited to explore this topic of food sovereignty and really do that through the voices and experiences of the leaders that we have with us here today. And so hopefully today's discussion will just kind of help deepen our understanding of what food sovereignty means, why it matters, and how it's being put into practice by individuals and communities. And I think this is really important because when we're talking about food sovereignty, we're protecting not only our food systems, but also culture, health, and so much more. And before we really dive into the event today, just some quick housekeeping items. We will have a Q&A option towards the end of the session today, so please use that Q&A box in Zoom to submit any questions that you might have for our speakers. And we plan to transition over to the audience Q&A around 12:50 Central Time, depending on how that conversation's going. And today's webinar is going to be closed captioned. So if you want to turn those on, go ahead and do that using the option on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, our team after today will be developing and sharing a written resource guide connected to this information so that you'll have some access to some of the key takeaways. But we're also looking forward to be able to provide the recording and some really great quotes from our speakers in that guide. And just to provide some context for today's event before we go into the session itself, at Native Governance Center, we like providing context for these different topics because we understand we all have different understandings and we're all at different processes of our learning. And so at NGC, we define sovereignty as the natural right of a people to govern themselves. So they're able to make decisions for their people, their lands, and their futures. When we're thinking about food sovereignty, that is a really tangible expression of our sovereignty. And so it's about the right to design our food systems to fit our unique needs, our rights, our resources, and our traditional values and lands as well. And during the first global forum on food sovereignty in Mali, they had a declaration that defined food sovereignty, which I have the quote for here. And it says, food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce distribute, and consume food at the heart of the food system and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations. There is a kind of related description from the US Department of the Interior, and they describe food sovereignty as, quote, the ability of communities to determine the quantity and quality of food they consume by controlling how their food is produced and distributed. So a little bit different, maybe missing some of that cultural element, but very much related to that previous example. And I think it's important when we're thinking about food sovereignty to understand that it really goes beyond access to food when we think about Native nations and communities. It again ties back to our self-determination and sovereignty, but also to just our overall well-being and cultural continuity in our communities. And so when Native communities lose access to traditional or what some folks call first foods, the impact really goes beyond nutrition. It goes into cultural impacts, spiritual impacts, and just this communal loss of the ability to hunt, fish, and gather traditional foods severs our connection and knowledge that has been built up over thousands of years with our peoples. And so thinking on that, food sovereignty work today is really in existence because of centuries of colonial disruption to food systems and ways of being. And so I think some of us are probably familiar or have seen photos of how bison herds were kind of systemically slaughtered across the Great Plains. And that was a direct tactic to force Native nations into food dependency and really shifting our foodways. And it's important to note that this kind of destruction happened everywhere. It was through the introduction of non-native plants and livestock, through land dispossession, through policies that actually criminalize traditional food systems or ways of hunting, gathering, and being. And while some folks think that this is maybe a thing of the past, unfortunately, we've really seen it continue in different ways. And so a example that I actually wasn't familiar with until I attended college in the Pacific Northwest was the 1970s tribal fishermen in the Pacific Northwest being arrested, being beaten, and harassed for really just trying to exercise their treaty protected rights to fish on their ancestral waters. These were rights their ancestors had secured for them generations earlier, and this at the time was known as the Fish Wars. And it saw a lot of violence escalating against Native peoples just for accessing their traditional foods. And I think it's really cool to understand that some of these same families involved in the Fish Wars and Native nations involved in that were actually behind the successful fight for the largest US dam removal in 2024. And so food sovereignty often connects to these broader efforts like dam removal and river restoration, because for many Native nations, restoring these rivers and waterways leads to a restoration and revival of traditional populations of things like salmon and lamprey. And really having healthy waterways is just as much about protecting food sovereignty sources as it is about just environmental support and protection as well. And today we kind of continue seeing threats to food sovereignty. An example that I wanted to reference was just from recent funding and cuts to funding, puts a lot of our culturally relevant programs that partner with state or federal programming at risk. And so one example that we've shared in the past is the Wisconsin Elders Food Box program, and they provide culturally relevant foods like bison, wild rice, salmon from Indigenous producers directly to tribal elders in Wisconsin. And having that at risk is really unfortunate and just shows that our systems are still vulnerable to these disruptions today. But I think in good news, it is not all negative. There are so many Native nations and leaders who are rebuilding their traditional foodways, revitalizing those ecosystems, as I shared with the dam example, and really just asserting their sovereignty in powerful ways. So across Native nations and community, food sovereignty takes on so many different forms, which I know our presenters will dive a little bit more into today. But this can look like gathering and harvesting. So many families and communities, for example, like mine, have maybe berry picking or medicine gathering areas that they return to each year that's kind of passed down through generations. And these spaces have really deep cultural meanings and spiritual meanings, but they can also be threatened by overexposure and environmental change. So it's important that we uphold our traditional knowledge, but also find ways to protect it. And then we also see this through our native chefs, businesses, food producers. They're using their platforms to really just revitalize our traditional foods and ingredients and share those stories to a broader audience that can kind of raise awareness and build up that protection while creating pathways for economic and community sustainability as well. And then I also just want to highlight education and policy are huge. So teaching and advocating for food sovereignty at community and policy level really just helps folks understand what it is, understand that it's not a trend, and really that it's a return to Indigenous governance and how we can care and be in relationship with our lands and waters. And food sovereignty really just doesn't exist in isolation, as I've covered a lot. It's woven into so many different aspects of who we are as Native peoples, and it's really not a single issue effort. It's connected with land use, natural resource management, language revitalization, environmental justice, and so much more. And so, as Native peoples, I think many of us recognize our responsibility to the land and waters and really want to advocate for our plant and animal relatives. These foods and animals and plants are really more than just resources, they are our relatives. And so, to fight for food sovereignty is a fight for all of these interconnected issues. And really making sure that we restore these things or rebuild so that the next generation has the ability to live in good relations to what's around them. And I know that was hopefully some good content, but maybe a lot to get all at once. And so I want to very briefly introduce today's incredible speakers that we have lined up. We're really glad that they can join us as we explore this topic today of food sovereignty and really just want to honor their time and their experiences and what they have to share today. And so I want to give them a moment to introduce themselves. You might be familiar with them and the work that they do, but to kind of kick off our conversation today, the question that I have for you all is just kind of, if you can, take a moment to introduce yourself. We know that food sovereignty is really central to each of your lives and works, but we also know that food sovereignty can have different meanings for different people. So in your introduction, just kind of tell us about yourself, whatever you'd like to share. And if you could answer, how do you personally define food sovereignty and how it's important for your community? And really just whoever wants to start us off.
I can start. My name is Dave Archambault. I serve as the CEO of Woju, which is a native-led nonprofit on the Standing Rock Reservation, and we're focused on regenerating people, land, and culture. Food sovereignty to me basically means having the ability and the responsibility to feed our own people through our own values and relationship to the land. And it's not just about producing food, but it's about restoring that connection that our ancestors had. And the reason why it's important is I think the what's happening in this world today, the instability of uh, national governments, state governments, tribal governments. Um, if anything goes wrong, or if there's the way this current administration is implementing our own armed forces in our own country. Uh, One of the things that is known historically is that food is one of the ways to attack are to starve. And with our ancestors, it was starve or survive, and that really put some constraints on what we can do in the future. So we live in a area where there's no grocery store, no Walmarts or no food chains, and so they would say it's a food desert. But we have food all around us, and so we just try to uh, reintroduce that food that exists on our lands, and reintroduce teachings that our ancestors had, so that if there is a time where food becomes weaponized, we have the ability and the resilience to feed ourselves. Check.
It looks like we're playing chicken. I can go next. All right, Sagoli Swagweg, Ganyata Gelu Niunget, Sungwehwene, Becky Webster Niunget so Slunige, Wagwaho Niugit Talod, Unete Aga Niwagahonjot, Tulunkawane Niwagenyu. So what I just said in English is greetings, my friends. My name is Ganyata Gale, which means snow scattered here and there. My English name is Becky Webster. I'm Wolf Clan. I am Oneida, and I grew up near Duck Creek that runs through our Oneida Reservation here in Wisconsin. So like a lot of us, I wear different hats. I also oftentimes introduce myself as a recovering attorney. I was an attorney for my tribe for 13 years before switching over to my current hats, which is I'm an associate professor and director of graduate studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth in the Department of American Indian Studies. Um, and while I was an attorney, one of the things I did to escape was I escaped to the gardens. So I like to think of an old John Mohawk quote when he said, I became a professor so I could be a farmer. So I also am the executive director of Umguaqua, which is a 15-acre farmstead here on the Oneida Reservation, where we aim to teach people about seed keeping, growing and planting and harvesting and cooking and making traditional tools and crafts that go along with caring for our foods. So we've become kind of like an educational spot and a source for seeds for our community and extended communities. So with that little bit of that hat of having been an attorney and having been in the courtroom and having that, a little bit of an assertive stance, I carry that over in my definition of food sovereignty, in that we should be able to have access to healthy and culturally appropriate food, and we should be able to engage in those sustainable food production. We should be able to safeguard, and I think this one's the most important, safeguard our agricultural practices that include planting, harvesting, and preservation. So those are kind of wrapped up into one of our philosophies here on the farm, is that every time an Indigenous person plants a seed, that is an act of resistance, an assertion of sovereignty, and a reclamation of identity. So I think all of those things wrapped together make that important for us. Like some of the things Cree was talking about at the beginning, that I think it's important for us to pick back up those pieces that our ancestors had to lay down in order to just survive colonization, assimilation, and removal. And it's pretty exciting right now because we're in a time of reclamation and celebration. And it's really great to be riding this wave of food sovereignty movement and, seeing all of the things that's happening and all the positive things and the beautiful things that are coming from, all of those places of hurt that our ancestors had to face. So I'm really excited to be here and hear what everyone else has to share. Yawa.
Ha'a oki minania kuyui tukaru nu Ivy Pete. My name is Ivy. I am Paiute and Blackfeet. I was born and raised interior Salish Kootenai territory in Spokane, Washington. So right along Big Beautiful River tributary, which connects to the Columbia. I am currently an undergraduate student studying out in Mohegan, Pequot, Narragansett territories. I think a lot about food systems, Native American studies, specifically food sovereignty and the ways that Native people having our foods, our hands in the land, is healing our communities. And more broadly, thinking about how policy and agriculture itself is a symptom of dispossession and colonialism across Turtle Island. And so I've been very grateful across the past couple of years to have many experiences all over Turtle Island and down in Aotearoa as well, learning how food sovereignty is more than just, a struggle that we face and fight for in Turtle Island, but all over the world. Food sovereignty is a movement that connects Indigenous people all over the globe. And I think as we start to think more about the term and the development of all this literature around, what is it? Ultimately, it's an expression of our community's power to determine how they grow, prepare, share, eat food, and a reflection of our relationships to land and water. And so I think the more that power is equitably shared among all of our people in a food system, the more likely it is that people have access to adequate food, right? We know that the local production of food prevents poverty. It prevents food insecurity. It heals our land. It has creates better soil quality. And so the more that our relationship with the land and water is based on this care and reciprocity, the more we understand ourselves in relation to the lands around us by growing foods, by planting these seeds. I think it's much easier for people to start establishing these relationships with each other as well, based on care and reciprocity. And so I am so honored to, be on this panel and speak amongst so many incredible Native people who are doing such cool work. And I feel that I'm very much still a learner in this space. I can share, my hope for food sovereignty and my hope for a food future is in the spirit of the land, right? I dream of a food future that is localized and Indigenous. And I really feel deeply that our liberation the liberation of our foodways, rather, is the liberation of our people. And so I know that can come in our lifetimes if we all live with this, informed by a deep conviction to be in good relation and to have our hands in the soil, learn about the plant relatives around us, and carry those seeds. And so really honored to be here. I will also share, I serve as the seed keeper here at the Yale Farm. And so I've had the great opportunity and privilege to start to build out sort of a program here at the university where we're connecting with local Indigenous peoples and tribes to start to piece together how these power relationships, right? Universities, land grant universities especially, that have had such, terrible histories of land dispossession and colonization, how we can now use the knowledge here and the resources here to be uplifting Indigenous people, to steward seeds, and to build networks of Indigenous peoples, far beyond just that local community. And of course, have been grateful as well to travel on behalf of the university and learn so much from our relatives, our Maori relatives, as well as those First Nation communities just north of the border. Really excited for our conversation. Pijoi, thank you.
Bonjour, Nagani Benes and Nago, Makonandubdem, Nasobakandrikari Eshkanigawan Bayan. Hello, everybody. My name is Nagani Benes. I'm also known as Derek Nicholas. I'm a member of the Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe. I hope you all know where Red Cliff is. It's one of the most beautiful res you can go to. Or in Lake Superior, northern Wisconsin. I'm the Traditional Foods Nutrition Program Coordinator at Division of Indian Work. I'm also the founder of WeSnig LLC. And basically, the work that I do is kind of focused around revitalizing Indigenous food systems amongst tribal communities. I'm really grateful to be here today and share the space with so many people that I think so highly of. So it's a big honor, and I feel grateful to be here. And for me, I think food sovereignty goes so deep. It's so deep and vast, and it's all interconnected with our whole aspect of being. I don't think you can have food sovereignty without culture. I don't think you can have culture without food sovereignty. And what I mean when I say that is because I think nowadays everyone kind of puts food sovereignty in a box, and most of the faces that make up food sovereignty movement are usually chefs or food producers. But for me, it goes way beyond that. If you're a moccasin maker, you should have a relationship and know how to hunt and how to skin out animals and tan the hides and how to make sinew. If you're a pipe maker, you should have a relationship with the sumac tree. And it even goes beyond just like traditional practices. But if you're a marine biologist, you're part of food sovereignty, be able to study water quality and how it's affecting our wild rice. Or if we have a lawyer that can advocate for clean water to protect our wild rice. So for me, food sovereignty is ultimately finding your identity. I'm a I'm a strong believer that everyone has a gift. You know, those plants and animals have gifts, but we're no different. We all have a gift. And when we begin to revitalize our indigenous food systems, you can find your place within our traditional food systems, ultimately bringing identity forward and finding purpose and value within your life, and which will ultimately benefit not only yourself but your community. So I believe that everyone should be involved in the food systems and find out where they can make an impact to not only strengthen our health and well-being, but our future. Oh, thank you.
Miigwech, thank you all. I think those were just some really beautiful definitions, and I love hearing about the work that you all do. And I think that was a great lead into this next question, because some of you provided little ideas already in terms of how folks can maybe get involved in this work or start taking action, whether it's just getting out and like kind of having your hands in the dirt, as Ivy said, those ideas from Derek in terms of what your gift is and maybe how that connects to this movement. And then even what folks were sharing around just kind of mindset shifts, excuse me, in their communities. So not really viewing these as maybe food deserts or communities where we don't have food, but looking at what's around us and the many different foods and medicines that do exist. And so, one question we had is, what are some actionable ideas for folks, whether they're living in their home communities, maybe in an urban area, who are looking to build their relationships with traditional foods and plants? And I know, Derek, you provided some good examples there. Would you mind starting us off?
Yeah, totally. So for me, with kind of like a little bit of background with my story, I got deeply involved within the food systems, native food systems in 2017 when I was gifted an ancient seed bundle. So initially my work revolved around the domesticated ones, but as I continue to dive deeper into our traditional foodways, my elders instructed me to start working with those wild beings. So now I strictly work with the wild ones. And in an urban space, you know, I live here in Minneapolis. I'm often just driving every day after work or my weekends to go harvest and go look for those wild plants. But I know not everyone has those means to do so. But urban foraging might be a way that people connect with our food systems. I know it's often kind of frowned upon, you know, picking out in the cities, but the interesting thing is like if a plant is growing in a toxic area, it doesn't mean that the whole plant is toxic. So a lot of those plants only store the toxins within a certain part of the plant. So just give an example like the roses. The roses will store all their toxins within the rose hips, but you know you can still use those thorns, the roots, the flowers, and that's kind of like that with all those different plants. So just education is a very important thing. So when you kind of, I always recommend someone just start getting familiar with like one plant, and then just continue to expand from there. Like what we're seeing today with a lot of you know, expansion and capitalism, who knows what life's going to look like 100 years from the future? Maybe even people on the res will actually be doing urban foraging too. So I guess just a great thing to have in your back pocket. And for me, I've always had also like an elder in my life, and my elders have always talked about that too. There's always like an elder in your life that's going to kind of take you under their wing. And I think that whether you're in on the res or in the city, you know, you should try to get out in the community and connect with those elders. And then when one like really kind of takes a keen to you and you feel like good energy back from them, you should really try to stick to their hip and learn as much as you can, and to have like a very generous relationship, to give as much as you can back to them. And I think that's like a great way to get more involved in the food systems. It might not look like you're really doing the work, but at the end of the day, you are, because you're just always going to be learning, and that knowledge can be it can be transformed to doing the work. You know, just taking the teachings or taking the knowledge And so it's all about just kind of building yourself up in that way.
Mm.
Thank you.
Similarly, Derek, I've been taught that as well. I have an elder in my life, a Spokane matriarch. Her name is Dr. Melody Wynn, and she teaches us that even when you don't have a teacher in your life, or when you don't have a teacher around, the land is always there to teach you, right? And so going back, going outside and learning about those plant relatives, picking just one plant in a whole year and focusing and developing and going back and building that relationship, learning about their different cycles of life, just how we have, is so important. And I think importantly also, and for people, an action item that we can take is to start to understand our rights as Indigenous people, right? And so food sovereignty is a right, food is a right. And then in its collective dimension, it creates this really powerful tool for us to start enacting our rights over land and territory. And so I think when we think about food sovereignty as a climate solution, when we start talking about it as a climate solution, it becomes more relevant to our broader communities. We can think about what food sovereignty does for, biodiversity loss, how it prevents biodiversity loss, what it does for hunger and sort of this revitalization of kin-based economies. What it teaches us about traditional ecological knowledge. All of this can come from just going out and being with the land, trying to start to understand all these dialogues and conversations happening around us. And also, I think something actionable and something I've learned from young people, being around young people. We got to visit Wozhu this summer. I was in a program at North Dakota State University, and that brought together a cohort of 30 Native youth from all over the country. And what I was so inspired by was all these young people have immense and big, broad visions for the future, right? Like we, especially as young people, can imagine what sustainable, sovereign, Indigenous food systems might look like. We have these grand ideas, and I think it's so important for anyone who's starting to think about food sovereignty to know that like those visions, those hopes for the future, we can enact them, and we shouldn't dilute any of our dreams or goals for a food system or a food future because of where we are right now. And so I think that's something that I would say is actionable for everyone, is to start imagining, what do we really want our food system to look like? How do we want to eat? What do we want our babies to know? How do we want them to know our foods? And work backwards from there, because any sort of concession we make towards, this current agro-capitalist food system is taking away our ability to dream and to imagine sort of the implementation of traditional ecological knowledge in our Indigenous future.
I can build off of that. That's beautiful. You both, Derek and Ivy, talked about capitalism and kin-based economies and relationships. So I think an actionable item could be to nurture and encourage the barter system. So, for example, here on our farm, people come to us asking for corn quite a bit, and I say, yes, we have corn to share. And then they say, well, how much does it cost? And then we say, well, it's not for sale. And then they get, kind of sad because they feel like they don't have anything of worth to share. And that's really disempowering because so many people in our community are used to defining their value based on what somebody's willing to pay them for their labor. And we all, as human beings, have so much more value than that. We have so many gifts to share. So we do all kinds of trades for things, jams and jellies and venison and elk and, you know, um, just all kinds of different food items. We also have done trades for singing lessons for our daughters when they were homeschooled, finding medicines in the woods. My husband even traded once for a 1980s He-Man castle. So, it's all up for discussion, and it's about building those relationships, nurturing those relationships, having conversations, and really understanding. And talking to each other again, because when we see each other as people and not just as a simple transaction, I think that those relationships help nurture us as a community, but also gives more credence to the foods that we're sharing, because those foods also shouldn't be defined by a dollar either. So I think that by having those types of conversations, I think that's a true and actionable thing that you can do, whether or not you're in the city or if you're on a res or if you're out somewhere, to recognize the gifts that we have in each other and that the abundance of the world around us provides.
That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And I so agree, right? Like getting to know a place and being able to build relationships that are mutually reciprocal, right? We're building reciprocal relationships is so powerful, and that's not scalable. That's not something that's for profit or product, but that's something that's a long and slow process of making relation that cannot be subverted, right? That's sort of like I think there's a scholar that says it's like a slow insurrection that takes place when we reject that capital framework and we decide to take on this slow, relational, and intentional way of relating and being. And I think also something so important that Derek mentioned is this idea of mentorship, right? Investing in mentorship pathways in our young people, giving them opportunities to go out onto the land. And of course, they don't need to know what they're doing, but just, being there, being present, and having elders around to teach. And perhaps Dave, you could share as well about Woju. I know that's so powerful, the way that young people are brought in low stakes ways, and allowing them to build these slow relationships that can grow over time, generationally even.
Yeah, we have some young people that come out, but the introduction to Woju isn't through food, but through movement. We want young people to get out and move and be on the land, and then once we get them to start thinking about where they're at on the land, and it's like, what is an alternative to a device, whether it's an iPhone or a computer or whatever? What's an alternative to that? A game? What are those alternatives? And what we see is the land being the alternative, getting people out and looking at the land, and then learning about what we eat. The first thing is we got to eat. So what are we eating? And once we start learning about what we're eating, we can start exploring where it comes from. So uh, what are the main things that we try to do is I'll give an example. I have a grandson, and he just loves the garden. But he's 3 years old, and he can identify a strawberry plant. And there's wild strawberries, so we'll be walking on the trail, and he could find a wild strawberry plant. And then we have domestic strawberries that were grown in our garden. He can identify those. And then there's a plant that's in our greenhouse that looks like a strawberry plant, but it's actually not a strawberry plant. So we go in the greenhouse and we try to clean those plants up, but we can't do it when he's present because he'll scold you for pulling strawberry plants. And I think that's where everything starts, is just planting something with kids, and watching it grow and taking care of it and having some responsibility. And it's not always just kids. Like, we go into our community and we put in garden boxes for elders and people with low mobility. But and then they're real small, like 6x6 garden box. You could grow so much out of them, but it's a lot of responsibility and it's a lot of work. And it's not something that we want to grow for them. We want them to experience that and start to identify some of the plants, the weeds. And those are like real basic, but it's real simple. And once one person grows abundance of food, they're trying to give it back to Woju so we can disperse for others, because they don't need all of that and it's perishable. But it's I think the easiest actionable step for anybody is to try to plant something and watch it grow. And all the teachings and all the lessons will come from that. Even with elders who never grew anything in their lives are starting to see the reward of planting. They might know what they ate in the past, but because of colonization, there's a disconnect there. So we have to let them experience that, and you find out that elders are more responsible than younger people, and they want to see things through. But yeah, I would just say planting something and nurturing it, and that's one of the most rewarding things for anyone.
I appreciate those. I think, yeah, there's no replacement for being with the land and really developing those relationships for them yourselves. And so one big takeaway, I think many of you brought it up, is just getting started, like having that one plant that you plant or go and visit with and really develop that relationship, learn about them more, and then grow and maybe see where that takes you. And I think whether you are maybe living in a reservation or rural area or you're in a city, mentorship is so key to really finding your gifts or finding where you fit within the broader food sovereignty movement. Because there's so many potential actions you can take and things you can do once you kind of learn more about yourself, but also this whole wide world of food sovereignty and maybe what it can look like. And really appreciate everyone's focus on generations and relationships. I think we talk about that a lot as an organization, and those things take, first of all, they take effort and intention, but they also just take time. They are things that don't develop overnight. And much like watching a plant grow, you might need to give it more attention during certain seasons. You might need to change its surroundings or change some of the nutrients, and really just paying attention and nourishing those relationships, whether they're with other people or our plant and animal relatives. And you all have already given some really cool examples of what this maybe can look like in your communities or what it does look like. But I think it's really just powerful to see how food systems that reflect sovereignty and self-determination are growing and expanding. And so, one question we have is, are there any examples that stand out to you, whether it's from your own work or from others, that really show what's possible when Native nations or peoples can lead these food systems? And if you do have an example, or even if you don't, are there ways that you would like to see that grow in the future? I think, Ivy, you had a really beautiful point about continuing to dream and keeping those dreams as possibilities and future realities, not just ideas. Yeah, and so wondering if y'all have any examples you want to share about how this kind of changes when there is Native leadership, and how you might want to see some of these efforts grow in the future.
One of the examples that you had actually mentioned during the opening was the Tribal Elder Food Box in Wisconsin. And I don't know a whole lot about it, but one of my good friends, Jen Falk, was instrumental in helping coordinate all of that. And I think the lesson that we learned from that is when you empower our community members to be producers, that they can produce, and then in turn, that cooperation between tribes to be able to coordinate that. And if anyone's not familiar with it, they have a few videos out there that just the amount of boxes that they serve or they deliver weekly during, that chunk of the year is just astounding, and it's hard to wrap your head around. And our farm considered participating in the food box. We may in the future, but I think that you have to have like 2,000 units of something to just participate in 1 week of the food box. So those people that are producing for the food box, it's really beautiful to see, our indigenous foods coming into those food boxes instead of the food boxes that we were seeing like during the height of the pandemic with, a lot of milk and other dairy products, things that weren't really meant for us. So when you give control back to our community members and encourage them to be producers, the beautiful things that you can see in those boxes. I know so many community members, my parents included, are always excited. They're always in line to get their elder food boxes, because they're excited to see what's in there and what communities helped contribute to them. So I think that's really beautiful.
So much of what I've learned about food sovereignty has come from the Spokane Tribal Network. So the first year after my college, I went home for the summer, and I was honored to be invited out to the Spokane Tribal Network's food sovereignty site, where the tribe was granted a 18-acre plot right on the river, and it had been, monocropped for generations, for many, many decades. And you know, to have been taught that it takes 50 years to bring back, you know, 1 inch of topsoil, is to think in this generational view that was really antithetical to what I had, you know, learned in the past about land reclamation. And so once again, that Dr. Melody Wynn, she had this grand idea for building a site in this beautiful place where all generations could come down and learn and grow together. And in the past, you know, 4 years since I've become involved down there, the site has just grown exponentially. It started with a food garden in sort of a circular plot where all these different foods were growing throughout the year and sort of formed like a calendar almost, where different foods would come up at different times in the season. And now there's a food forest growing. There's a plant identification walk. There's a greenhouse. And there's all these other sort of resources that are coming about. And so I have just been so inspired by that project because of the fact that it, you know, it was just a monocropped, you know, couple acre site on the river for so many years. And now it's this beautiful place where, you know, young people are going, where classes can visit to, you know, engage with the land, where there's active water reclamation happening, where there are seeds growing. And in a very similar way that you mentioned, you know, it's not a place where there's tons of boxes of foods being distributed to the community every week or every month, but in the future, that could be an opportunity, you know, and there's still so much value in just creating a space where art is encouraged and where native plants can grow and where people are learning. And I think that's such a good reminder for me as well, always, right? Like this timeline is not something that's always recognizable to us, but when we can start to think more about like the benefits of soil quality, for example, in a generational view, we're building diverse and resilient local ecosystems that will go on long beyond us. And that was so inspiring. And I would share as well, I mentioned I was able to visit Aotearoa, be down in New Zealand, looking at the way that there are some marae communities bringing back their traditional marae economies, right? Shortening value chains so that families are growing food in their marae and their whenua and their traditional land. And that food is being shared with the immediate community. That's bringing back not only that relationship to their land, but bringing back families to come together for celebrations, right? For ceremony, for protocol and things like that. And I find that so inspiring, thinking about the way that sort of this like indigenizing our food system can become a communal responsibility that we all uphold in the long term. Also really fascinating and something powerful with that model is that families and communities are able to share resources. And so I think often a barrier to taking back our land and starting to farm or produce, you know, agriculture again is that there's such a high bar to entry for, you know, working the land. And so sharing tools and equipment, sharing knowledge and resources, having opportunities for families to come together and share what's happening on my farm down the road or share what's happening on the other side of the hill. So important and a great opportunity to keep learning.
Yeah, I think there's so many different great organizations, communities, and groups that are really doing the work and bringing so many good things to our community in terms of food sovereignty. But for me, where I truly draw inspiration are from like the individuals that are really being self-determinant. And I think one big barrier that our people are facing is just like the whole idea of like consumerism. It's really just being consumers and not honoring the land for all it has to give. Because man, the land has so much to give us, and it's a very beautiful thing when you can be on the land and really start to learn those things. I mean, people don't really catch me in the store. I don't really do stuff like that. Gosh, I mean, don't get me wrong. I will buy fresh underwear and fresh socks. That's one thing I refuse to do hand-me-downs for. But you know, it's like I haven't been to a grocery store for my home use in 5 years. I don't go to the dentist. I think I got pretty good smile, nice white teeth. I don't go to the doctor. You know, the land can give us all those things we need to do to take care of ourselves. Because not only you're just saving so much money out of your pocket, but then you're utilizing the gifts of the land. My elders always tell me is like when those wild beings, if they're not being used no more, they don't think they're needed, and they'll end up going home back to the spirit world. So For me, it's just like super important to actually like use these plants and animals for their gifts because that's what they're here for. They're here to take care of us, and if we stop honoring them, they won't feel like they need to stick around anymore. So that's what I'm always preaching, and I think the best way to like do that is like I don't know, be an example of that. Truly, just like show that you don't need to operate in today's world in the modern society. You can truly, even if you're living in the city, you can truly take care of yourself and the land and what it has to offer. I do understand that, it's like people have to pay bills and, you know, have car insurance and all that kind of stuff, but it's still a way to incorporate our native values into making money. So for example, with like my business, Weesnig LLC, I practice the economy's generosity, the modern system, like capitalistic system, people want to get as much as they can for as little as possible and vice versa. You want to get the biggest bang for your buck. But for me, my model is like I give as much as I can, and in return, I hope the receiving party can give as much as they can. I know some places, hey, they get the funding. You look at Shakopee, man, that casino is racking it in. They can be very generous, hook it up. But then there's some communities that I go to, like they don't get any money really, and like that's crazy work to like say, oh, you can't afford my services. I can't help you this and that. But with this business model of economies of generosity, you get to help more people this way. You get to help the people that can be very generous. You get to help the people that don't have as much resources. At the end of the day, it all equals out, and you get to reach more people. And I think when we can incorporate more of our values, stop being so much of a consumer, I think it opens up so many doorways, whether it's like within your personal life, but then also those people that are looking in and they can have some self-reflection and make some changes in their life, ultimately helping the food sovereignty movement as a whole.
I would just add, I think there's a lot of, I would say that there are a lot of there's a lot of interest in growing movement towards food sovereignty, even though it's like, what is that defined as? What what's the definition of food sovereignty? And you could interpret it any way you want. Um, Lawyers find ways to interpret food sovereignty or even just terms multiple ways. But I think what we're seeing is a growing population of people and organizations striving to understand and striving to build a food system that is local within their community. Um, and then to care for the land and care for the water in that process. And I attended IAC, what is that? Indian Agriculture Council conference and first one I attended, it was all about policy and farm bill and ag, um, monocropping, ranching. And then the following year, I seen a shift where there's more of a regenerative mindset in the organization. And today I think that's across the board. I would say like the native seed sharing, understanding where seeds come from. Like we live along the Missouri River, close to the Mandan and Hidatsa sites. And there was an archaeological dig where they had a cache of seeds. So they planted the seeds, and 3 generations later, these are non-Indians, park rangers, 3 generations of this plant growing. We call it a Rickraw squash. So that really starts to spark your interest on how our ancestors preserved seeds, and we have seed keepers today, and it's a network where they're more than willing to share uh, tobacco, like growing tobacco here. That was really interesting. Um, so I think it's just like anytime you could come across that network where somebody has some seed and let's try it. Growing some Inca corn in North Dakota sounds crazy, but let's try it. anyway, I think there's a lot of examples, and I think there's just a trend and a movement towards that because we see the importance of caring for our land.
I've been so inspired to see sort of the mixing of people's traditional teachings in this way as well, right? So we see seed sharing and sort of the implementation of many different cultures coming into one place and investing their love and their care. And we know, as Derek was saying, right, like when we put our good words into the soil, it comes back to us in abundance. And so I've learned and I try to uphold in all my work, like when we do this good work, we offer our blessings, we offer our prayers, and we give an offering in tobacco to the land, you know. And always there's opportunity to integrate ceremony, to integrate our traditional teachings into the agricultural space. So whether that's during planting, making sure to take the time to bless the ground, to give an extra prayer, to thank the seeds. When it's harvesting, you know, make sure that we're being respectful and thanking the relatives for their gifts and feeding us. And I think just having been taught to add or to include and feel comfortable bringing the ceremonial aspect, bringing the sacred and the spiritual into all of our you know, engagements with the land is such a powerful way to start thinking about food sovereignty in the realm of the political, the social, the spiritual, and the cultural. I'm grateful to many teachers, Dr. Royce Young-Wolf and others here at the university who are doing that as well. Have taught me, you know, even in a space highly colonized in a really, you know, tough history here, that we can still indigenize the space. We can still bring our teachings and start to educate people about the power of our traditional knowledge in the food space.
And I have such a deep appreciation for what a lot of you shared in terms of just the generosity that exists with leaders in different communities when it comes to the knowledge that's held, the seeds, the different things. I know in my own community, we have a bison herd now, and it's doing some incredible things in terms of food, but also environmental restoration and all these beautiful things in our community. And that was made possible by a partnership with another Native nation. So being able to share things like bison and being able to share our seeds with one another and provide that deeper learning, but also provide those new or maybe reconnecting relationships with that being or with that plant. And so I think that's just such a beautiful and powerful aspect of food sovereignty is the wealth of knowledge out there and resources, but also how willing folks are with sharing that with other Native nations or with other leaders. And when we're thinking about these incredible leaders, we also think about maybe the larger structures that they are or are not a part of in the work that they're doing. And I'm curious, some of you are connected to these agencies and some of you are not, but what role do you think tribal governments, Native nonprofits, and these grassroots movements have when it comes to strengthening food sovereignty? And yeah, anyone is welcome to answer that.
My two thoughts that I'll share and let others who are more experienced in this world speak. I would say, first of all, I think it's important to look towards these nonprofits that have investment streams to invest in young people, especially. So we look at something like the Center for Native American Youth, for example, tons of grants and opportunities for young people to implement their ideas and projects in their own communities. I think that's super important and valuable. And secondarily, I would say, and look to tribal governments to start subsidizing healthy foods, right? We talk about lack of food access in our reservation communities, or even for urban Indians, you know, in their communities. I think that it's so important, just on its face, you know, initial is that food becomes more accessible. Healthy foods are subsidized so that Native people can start accessing them and learn to, you know, not just grow vegetables, but also prepare and eat them. For my family, that's a huge one. Going to the grocery store and being able to afford, the healthier option, or the option that's grown from the soil, is so important. And I hope that tribal governments and state governments as well can look towards helping to fund and make that more accessible, to optimize health outcomes for Native people, as well as start to get us thinking more about our relationship to those healthy foods coming from the ground.
Sorry, Rebecca. I think the tribal governments can be supportive when it comes to policies or infrastructure. They can be supportive in helping people in this work get access to land, explore potentially processing facilities, whether it's for vegetables or for meat. And then I think nonprofits, they can create models where they can demonstrate practices. And then the grassroots people, they basically keep us grounded in our values. And so it's important to have all three of them to create a regenerative system when it comes to food sovereignty.
I was just thinking of some of the examples from my own community. I think kind of like what we've all been talking about is our gifts that we all have. I think that it's not just one solution for any community. I think we all have roles to play. Like for example, when we were early in our food growing journey, we had grown our traditional foods, and then the year after, we actually had a corn shortage in our community, because the tribe had grown our traditional corn and done a really good job of making people want the corn by serving it at different community functions, but then couldn't keep up with the demand that the community had. And at one of our general tribal council meetings, we had people come up to the mic and complain and say that there's not enough corn. Why aren't you growing enough corn? What's going on here? How come you're not being held accountable? We're hungry. We want this. You've made us want this. Now what's happening? And a bunch of us got together and said, wait a minute, I don't know that it's the government's responsibility to grow food for the entire nation. I think individuals bear some of that responsibility. So we formed a co-op. Um, and so that co-op has been growing corn ever since. But also, I think individual families have responsibilities to grow and nurture those relationships with our foods, and then in turn share that and trade and do all of those things. We run a 501(c)(3) nonprofit here at the farm. And by doing that, we are able to use grant funding to pay artists to teach classes here, to pay Indigenous chefs to cook our food and make sure that it is highly subsidized for our community members. We actually have a chef here right now in our commercial kitchen getting ready for tomorrow's meal. So it's just all of us with all of our different gifts have responsibilities to come together, and we all have different roles to play to be able to move our community together. And I think each community will have different needs, of course, but I think if we learn to rely on each other instead of just looking for one solution, I think we'll be all better off.
Thank you. Geez, I think this is a pretty heavy question. I think whether it's the tribal community, nonprofit, whatever business structure it may be, I think at the end of the day, the most powerful tool is keeping native lands in native hands. As you see, like native lands are often like have the most biodiversity and have the most resources because we know how to take care of the land and steward the land. And I know, geez, land is a finite resource, so it's you can't make more land. So I think just trying to like safeguard that and absorb as much land as we can, and then it can be used as a tool in whatever way we may need. I may as well just throw out this shameless plug right now. I'm working on acquiring land. I'm trying to get $1.2 million fundraised in order to buy a huge chunk of land, 200 to 300 acres in 1854 treaty. And with that land, I plan on building a cultural camp. It'd reflect a pre-colonial village, So you won't see any modern luxuries in sights, and it'd be a place where Native folks can come, make long-lasting relationships with each other, and do it all rooted in the culture. And getting that land isn't easy. I've been just grinding, applying for grants, trying to find private donors. So if anyone here on the call has got any leads, let me know. But it'd be great if, like my tribe would be able to support with that, or a nonprofit would be able to support with that. And but like I said, land's expensive, it's finite, and I think if whether it's an organization or tribal community, whenever there's extra funds laying around, just buy land, buy land, buy land. That's what I'd recommend because, we need land to practice food sovereignty and we need land to practice our culture.
And I would add just sort of another brief personal interest is exploring the avenues of international Indigenous solidarity, right? So looking towards things like the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, or exercising and understanding what does the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People tell us is our right, and going to these international forums, exercising these platforms to build solidarities across nations and across Indigenous peoples all over the globe is perhaps our most reliable tool towards building towards this food future, right? As we're thinking about the uncertainty of the US federal government, or these other colonial governments across Turtle Island. There are avenues being funded right now for Native people to go beyond what is just like in our present lives and communities, and look towards building global solidarity, learning from other Indigenous peoples and under other regimes and how they're building towards food sovereignty, I think is really important. And sort of course, the UNDRIP is so new. It has yet to really be defined for Native people. And so that's our generation. That's our job to start thinking about how do we weaponize that, or leverage it rather, towards building our sovereignty.
I appreciate everyone's responses because I think it just shows that there are so many opportunities and areas of support, and it really just depends on what you're called to, what your gifts are, and maybe how that can be incorporated into your work or way of being. And I think it's also really just a good sign to understand that the answers or solution, whatever word you want to use, is going to look different across communities, from urban spaces to native nations. What fits in one community might not work for another. And so it's really important for Native nations and community members to be able to build up their knowledge, develop those relationships so they can really dream and build out these systems that will work for them and will be relevant and be good, sustainable systems. And we do have one really good Q&A so far that I want to get to. But before we transition over to the audience Q&A, I just appreciate how many ideas have been shared already for kind of how folks can take action and get involved or maybe strengthen their support for food sovereignty after today. And so, if y'all don't mind sharing just kind of a quick call to action response, is there a step or maybe two steps you would recommend individuals can take after today, whether they're native or non-native, that would help really just support and sustain food sovereignty?
For me, I just recommend people being a good relative, think beyond yourself, think about the water, think about the plants, the insects, the soil. Um, take care of them because they take care of us. So, it absolutely kills me inside when I see people litter, um, speak negatively about the different wild beings. So, I think that's just like the most important step. Because once we start to have appreciation for the land, it's like a unifying thing. I think right now, our country is so divided, and I think we all share the same land, and we have to learn how to coexist together on the land. So once when we can all appreciate the land across any borders, I think that's just going to be like a very strengthening tool to draw alliance within all different communities that occupy this land nowadays. Whether it's our human relatives or our plant relatives or whatnot.
I would say that community gardens are a really powerful tool. And while they probably aren't going to solve, the global food crisis on their own, looking to places where gardening is happening, where community can be formed, where there's intergenerational knowledge sharing already happening is really important. And so I think looking towards these sites where we can grow food, where food is being grown, and recognizing that if we start to build these good relationships, if we start to know how to be a good relative, it's not easy, but it's simple. Being a good relative is simple. Being in good relation is not an easy thing to do, but it's something we can all work towards. And so looking towards those, gardens or places where resistance is forming through Indigenous agriculture is such a good way to get your heart into the work.
Quick and fast, rekindle relationships, rebuild new ones, bring bartering back.
I would just say support native-led or indigenous-led farms and ranches and food programs. Learn about where your food comes from, learn the stories, build relationships with the tribe, the organizations, and not just one project, but expand and then advocate for anything that restores land and water to native stewardship.
Beautiful responses. And I do think there's something for everyone from those responses, whether it is just kind of learning how you can support, learning where your food comes from, providing support or opportunities depending on what resources and what access you have. But I just want to thank everyone for their thoughts so far. I know one of my really big takeaways from this is just kind of, as Rebecca said, rekindling those relationships and really prioritizing this return, or maybe a better way to phrase it is indigenizing our ways of operating. So having those mindset shifts that allow us to see the abundance in our communities, having these shifts in the way that we do things that allow for reciprocity and for folks to recognize and act with their gifts. And I think that's just been such a cool part of this conversation that connects back into food sovereignty. So thank you all for that. And I know we have a couple questions coming in for the Q&A here. So I'm going to start with the first one in here, and I'm going to recap a little bit of it. But their name is Madison, and they are serving as an American Indian Education Coordinator. And they're starting to return to land-based teachings this year, focusing on food sovereignty, reconnecting students and families to Indigenous foods. And while they're striving to serve only Indigenous foods at program events, they also want to help build out community capacity to just kind of have that active, meaningful relationship with land. So, question for you all is looking back on your own journeys with food sovereignty, are there challenges or mistakes you encountered early on that taught you an important lesson about leading the work in a good way, especially when we're thinking about introducing these teachings to youth and community members, excuse me, in a school setting? And I think Derek had a really great answer to that question when he was talking about being a good relative and kind of having that values-based leadership. But does anybody have anything they want to add in terms of lessons learned in leading in a good way?
I think early on what we experience is a lack of community engagement, and it's just because in Indian country there's this distrust that exists, our lack of trust. And what I found was that we just keep doing the work, and we don't have to defend the work. If we're defending the work, then we just have to stop working. But if we just keep doing the work itself will defend. And so The longer we do it, the more we do it, we found that the more people become engaged. We have schools coming now wanting to learn about what Woju is doing when it comes to food, recreation, getting on the land. But it wasn't always like that. It was challenging because we were setting the stage for people to come in abundance, and we'd get a few, and we'd be disappointed, and we'd beat ourselves up, and then we start having to defend. But we just have to keep going, and more people start to come and start to want to learn, and it starts to expand and grow.
One of the lessons that we learned early on is to not be afraid to ask for help, because I think those people that are really have the same mindset and have that information or have the knowledge or have the capability are just waiting and excited to be able to be a part of it. So whenever we did put a call out to our community, we always had the help and the answers and the information we were looking for. So just again to rely on our community members, and then in turn then they feel that they are part of the movement, that they are helping, that they are part of the solution, to make sure that this information isn't lost again, and that it's not so hard for people to pick that back up again.
I guess one important lesson that I always carry with me is like I always try to come out of doing this work, come out of like a place of humility, especially like when I work with those wild beings. Everyone has different teachings, even like within the same family. There might be different teachings within a specific family, and I think that's just like the most important thing, to be open-minded, not to like put others down if they practice things in a different way or go about things differently. And I think that's finding like the beauty within like the differences of how people engage in the world is very empowering and can help us move forward in a better direction.
Awesome. And hoping to get more info on where this person is based. But one question that I know comes up for our org a lot, especially from non-native folks, but even native folks looking to prioritize those native foods and producers. Um, how do folks find you? Like, how do folks find those native foods or native producers near them, if you have any tips on that?
I'll just add a quick answer. That was Chef Anthony Warrior from Nebraska. He does some amazing stuff. So, and he has been to our trading post a few times, and we try to send him along with some goods. But for the volumes of people that he's feeding, I think the accessibility is, like you said, a question a lot of people are asking.
And I think that's such a maybe good problem to have at this point, where we're at the point where our producers maybe produce enough for certain communities or areas, but looking at how we can maybe scale that up and provide more in a way that's still sustainable and culturally relevant.
Yeah, I think just even just like reaching out to people, what they call it, like cold calling. I know like my reservation, we have a tribal garden. I think it's Bimantazewin garden. So even just like being able to call them up, be like, hey, I'm looking for XYZ. Do you have it, or do you know someone that can have it? And just calling around. And I think that kind of even elaborate more on the point that Rebecca was talking about. That's like a good way to establish those old time trade routes, is just kind of calling around, reaching out to people. And if you end up making a connection over at Red Cliff or over at Turtle Mountain or over at Oneida, you can just kind of continue to foster those relationships and make it like a reciprocal practice.
That's such a great example, especially when it comes to establishing relationships. One thing that we do for a lot of our in-person events is give a gift of, usually it's like wild rice, sweet grass, some different things from local communities that we work with. But wild rice, as many of you know, has kind of varying seasons. Sometimes there's a really big production of it. Sometimes there's not so much, depending on the climate and all of these different kind of things that feed into it. And so having those relationships really matters when maybe it's a bad ricing year and there's not a ton of rice available for folks to buy. So you're not able to just go into the store or go into the local community like trade area. And that's when those relationships can really come in clutch, but also are really beautiful for having that reciprocity and thinking about, okay, this person gave me something that's really valued and at this time scarce in the community. What can maybe I provide back as a thank you? Because I think to Rebecca's point, money is fine, but I would love to go beyond that and actually value all that went into the development of that food. And um, I'm gonna give it a moment, see if we get any other Q&A here, but just want to say thank you to all of you. This has been such an incredible conversation, and I feel like I learned so much. I was trying to take notes, but I know I'm just gonna have to watch the recording later once we have it to actually get everything. But do you all have any closing thoughts or things you would like to share? This is also a great time to shamelessly plug your own work if there's a way that folks can support you or kind of learn more after today too.
I would say lean on the youth in your community, uplift them, send them to those conferences, find a way to start a youth council, starting early and helping to build our young people's relationships to the land, help them to be leaders in our communities is such a powerful way we will build towards this Indigenous food future. So invest in the young people and trust that they will come into their gifts and their leadership.
Any other clothing thoughts here from our speakers?
I know I already did my shameless plug, but what's that? Monday's Indigenous Peoples Day. I got Indigenous person, send them like 20 bucks on Venmo, you know? Just kidding. That's my attempt to be funny. My bad.
I will happily take the $20 that Derek was kidding about. Um, No, but just again, I think our speakers were really incredible today. I appreciate so much knowledge that was shared and the stories and just learning more about what connects you to this work and also how it connects to so many other aspects of our lives and just our health and ways of being. So appreciate everyone for just the good energy they brought into today's event and want to say thank you to the speakers that joined us, but also all of the attendees that took some time to join today. Want to share one thing here once I get my screen going. Um, we will have a survey for this event. So I'm hoping my coworker can drop the link in the chat, but we'll have the recording available of this session later on our website for anybody that wants to watch or if you want to share that. And then we're also going to develop a written resource. So if you had a question maybe you didn't ask or we didn't get to today, hopefully that written resource can answer some of those for you and just provide some of the key context and good information that the folks shared with us today. And also want to say, really look for ways that you can support the projects and individuals you heard about today. I think our speakers are doing such incredible work, but depending on where you're tuning in from, there's also very likely a Native Nation or nonprofit or leader near you doing something equally as cool. So look out for opportunities and how you can support. think back to kind of the information given on how you can use your gifts and take action to be a good relative in this food sovereignty movement. And again, just thank you all for joining today. We'll make some of these things available later on, probably within the next few weeks. So keep a lookout for that. And again, to our speakers, Chimigwech, thank you so much. I appreciate each and every one of you for what you brought to today's session and just the incredible work you're each doing. I think it's just so hopeful when we get to hear about this food sovereignty work and the changes that are happening in community. So I saw some reactions come in. Go ahead and do like a clap or a heart if you want to for our presenters. I love seeing those. But just again, thank you so much. And hopefully we will see you again soon. Miigwech and Giga Wabaman.
Yawanko, onagiwa.
Easily.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Happy Tuesday.
Thank you all.